Welcome to the African News Review podcast, where we cut through the noise and get to the truth. I am your host, Adesoji Iginla, and each week we are here to challenge the biases, prejudices, and misinformation in the Western press about Africa. Using historical context and contemporary insights, we set the record straight and reclaim the narrative. Tune in every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we uncover the real stories and reshape the conversations about Africa. This is the African News Review podcast, reclaiming Africa's narrative, one story at a time. Greetings again and welcome to African News Review, a weekly conversation in which we take a look at the coverage of Africa in the Western media and construct the stories. I am your host as usual, Adesoji Iginla. And with me is none other than journalist and publisher Black Star News, a broadcaster WBAI 99.5 FM.org, New York Radio, Comrade Milton Allimadi.
Asante Sana as always, man. Good to see you again.
It's always a pleasure to have you. Again, yes, we do what we do best. We go into the Western media. And for our first story today, it comes from the Telegraph, from the UK newspaper, and it reads, Otto von Bismarck branded colonizer as protesters topple statue in Frankfurt, Germany. The 125-year-old bronze statue was left lying on the ground with red paint sprayed all over the body, face, and helmet. Germany's first chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, has been branded a colonizer by protesters who toppled and vandalized a monument dedicated to him in Frankfurt. Colonizer and anti-colonial action was painted across the statue, which police said had been sawn off its plinth before being pushed over Friday. The toppling came on the 140th anniversary of the start of the Berlin Conference, which is seen as emblematic of Europe's 19th century colonization of Africa. An unnamed group claimed responsibility, writing on a far-left website that Bismarck had initiated a violent conquest and exploitation of the African continent, which led to years of systematic exploitation and enslavement. He goes further. Frank Grober, a local state deputy for the Hard Right Alternative for Germany, AFD, said this is part of the left-wing extremist culture war and an attack on our history and identity. I will hold my next reading for your initial take on that article.
Right, well, you can the suspicion flag can easily be raised when you hear it described that he's been branded as a colonizer. Branded as a colonizer, he hosted the meeting for colonization in Germany. It's just completely, And then when somebody from the far right says it's an attack on our history, obviously, this history should include Nazi Germany and the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. So is he saying that that part of the history cannot be attacked? Or is he saying it's only when the violence is directed against Africans that that part of the history should not be attacked? So it should be clarified. And that's why the article is also very weak. The article should have asked him, okay, not all aspects of our history should be celebrated. Should we celebrate the Nazi era? Yes? No? So you're saying we should celebrate the German colonization of Africa, which has a very bloody history? Right. So that's where we fill in the gaps for our audience,
I mean, when you talk about the bloody history, do you want to delve a little deeper?
Of course, absolutely. This Telegraph article is almost like a press release for the far right to sort of ameliorate the impact of this toppling of the statue of Bismarck, which I hope, of course, actually sparks more such actions throughout Germany and also inspires others in European countries and even in African countries to really remove the symbols that still celebrate the colonial oppressors, that celebrate enslavers, So the article does not even mention the German massacre of people in Tanzania, in German East Africa. It does not mention the genocide in Tanzania. It does not mention the genocide of the Herero and Nama people in what was German Southwest Africa. Of course, which is now Namibia, even though Germany reluctantly has acknowledged that crime and, even agreed to provide, they didn't call it reparations, but some sort of remuneration, although insignificant, it pales to the crime committed. So that's the problem with this article. But that's why we select these kind of articles. You cannot stop these kind of articles and stories from being published. We know the agenda. It is up to us to catch these types of articles and to deconstruct.
Okay, I continue.
But I celebrate the toppling of the statue, as I said, and I hope it really makes other people in other locations, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in North America, whether it's in Africa, the Caribbean, whatever oppressors are still held up in esteem or celebrated with monuments, those monuments should be removed. If people say they capture a historical legacy, that's fine. Mm-hmm. Put them in the museums then. Remove them and take them to the museums where people can go and see them.
Instead of being glorified in public.
If they choose to do so. But don't put them in public display where everybody is obligated to see them.
Okay. It's important to underscore the fact that this event has come into consciousness again. We're talking now 140 years removed from the catastrophe that was visited on the continent in terms by nature of that conference. Could you explain how the imposition of lines have created what we now have today in terms of displacement of people through the very act of colonization itself, settler colonialism that was imposed on top of that, and then subsequent post-Second World War, what you now have in terms of neocolonialism?
Well, I think the best way actually to save the long history is just to look at the contemporary manifestations. The impact of colonialism, the impact of enslavement on Africa. That impact is still with us because in reality, colonialism has not ended in Africa yet. So we are still fighting against colonialism, even though many Africans are not aware that what they're fighting against is colonialism. Because what many Africans, and you cannot blame them, it's been misrepresented that colonialism was Europeans coming there and physically being in Africa, and thereby seizing sovereignty. And our sovereignty ended. So therefore, that was how they saw colonialism. So they mistakenly equated the removal of Europeans from Africa as the end of colonialism, when in fact, the physical presence was only part of it. What was most critical and what has sustained colonialism in Africa is, number one, the destruction of African institutions of governance, right? Our traditional governments were destroyed. The destruction of African culture, the destruction of African spirituality, the destruction of African languages, and then the hijacking of Africa's economies. So, for example, Africa, many African regions had established trade routes with China when some European states did not even exist. Many African states had established a long corridor from West Africa through North Africa, going all the way to Europe, to trade with Europe. Many Africans, and this is the part that's not well studied yet, had been able to sail across the Atlantic into what later on was referred to as the New World. So that was hijacked. They took away our production. You produce to satisfy your needs, correct? If you like eating a certain kind of food, you can grow it. That is what you grow on your farm. If you like wearing a certain type of clothes, you produce cotton, you produce textile, and then you produce the outfit. So now you're denied all those opportunities. And what you're told is, okay, you, Nigeria, you, Senegal, we want you to grow what they call groundnuts or peanuts in the United States. You in Uganda, we want you to grow tobacco. We want you to grow coffee, and we want you to produce cotton. You in Kenya, we want you to produce tea. Just think about that. So you're hijacking entire economies and saying, produce to satisfy my needs, but not your needs. And then I want you to abandon your own traditional outfits. I want you to buy the outfits that I manufacture in Europe using your cotton. And I am going to set the price for you. There's no bargaining. Forget that when you used to purchase items, you would go to your local market, right? Whether it's called a souk. There's no African country or region that does not have a market, right? A local market. You go there, you bargain, you negotiate, and then if you want, you buy the item, correct? Now Europe is coming and telling you, you are going to buy these shoes I'll manufacture. And this is the price. You're going to buy this a pair of pants or shirts at my price. That arrangement has not changed up to date. That is why Europeans continue to become wealthier and African countries continue to become more and more disenfranchised economically. In fact, we have what you may call economic retrogression because we continue to sell cheap. Even though our minerals are very valuable, we sell cheap and we buy at a very dear price from the so-called industrialized countries. So how can you say colonialism is over? So that is why it's important, because even though toppling of a statue, somebody could say, oh, this is just symbolism. No,
symbolism.
But it makes you start asking questions. Why are they targeting Bismarck? What was Bismarck involved in? What was the Berlin Conference all about? What happened as a result of the Berlin Conference? So it promotes more inquiry, more interrogation, more investigation. And that's why symbolism is also very important.
Just taking a quick break here on the African News Review podcast, but don't go anywhere. If you're enjoying our deep dive into the real stories behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Every Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're here to debunk the myths and bring you the truth about Africa. Want to help spread the word? Share this podcast with your friends and leave us a review. It goes a long way in helping others discover the real Africa. Without further ado, let's get back to setting the record straight. Thank you. And yes, before we move on, for those who would like to know more about the Scramble for Africa, you could read Thomas Peckerman's aptly named The Scramble for Africa. It's quite a volume, but it does justice to the subject matter. And yes, a Berlin Conference is the reason why we have countries that are not self-sufficient. Most of them are just basically satellite states for, as the good comrade said, for these European countries to come in and milk them. I mean, throughout our broadcast history, we've been talking about France and the countries in the Sahel region. That is a fallout of the Berlin Conference.
Right.
So, yes.
So many of those Africans, you could say they're European managers in African skin, unfortunately, because many of them have that neocolonial mentality. They celebrate Europe. They don't celebrate Africa. They identify with Europe. They don't identify with Africa. So Europeans were very smart. They selected the best candidates to continue Europeanism in Africa. It's very tragic. I want Europeans who are listening to this, any European, and I want them to share this thought with other Europeans. Imagine Africans coming to England or to Germany and saying, we like millet in Uganda. We want you to produce millet That is what you're going to produce. And if you don't produce millet, I don't know what they eat in Germany. I don't even know what you eat in England. I know potatoes or whatever. Don't produce potatoes. You choose to produce potatoes instead of millet. We're going to fine you, or we're going to imprison you, or we're going to flog you. Think about that. That's the kind of economic dictatorship they established in Africa. So now you're producing millet, producing something you don't even eat. You're selling it to me in an African country. And then I'm saying, okay, now you're going to buy XYZ from Uganda or from Kenya at this price. Hello? Think about that. I want you to think about that so that the essence of colonialism, really, and imperialism can start sinking into your mind. Because often they don't equate it that way. What if we were in their shoes,
Wow. And just like to add that it's also salient to know that most of those countries at the moment, on paper, technically don't trade with each other. They trade with...
Absolutely. Many of them don't even like each other enough because of the demonization of Africa, historically in Western media. So when they think of, how to make friends, many of them, I'm sure, the first thought, and particularly the leadership, who should be our friends? They think of Europeans instead of fellow Africans. So we need to decolonize the mind first, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o said in his book.
Speaking of decolonizing the mind, we'll go to the role of the media in our next story, which comes again from the Telegraph, and it's titled "China Wins Hearts and Mind," as it sets wins hearts and minds as it steps into the void left by the BBC World Service course. British soft power reduced as cooperation reveals it lost 40 million of its global audience alone by shutting its Arab and Persian services. The story is filed by Adrian Brufeld in Nairobi. It was bonfire night 2018 on the prep school playing fields across Nairobi. Children were oohing and ahhing at the fireworks. But the great and the good of Kenyan society, from the deputy president down, were attending a more rarefied celebration. At BBC's swanky new building on Riverside Drive, one of Kenya's capital's smartest thoroughfares, and later at a nearby hotel, they are gathered to witness what would have been a significant moment in the history of British soft power, the opening of the largest BBC bureau outside of the United Kingdom. The centerpiece of a 289 million global expansion funded by the British government could not have been more timely. Disinformation and propaganda, much of it emanating from Russia and China, was spreading across the continent, sowing division, promoting military rule, and planting suspicion in Western policy and philanthropy. I had to laugh. With 300 employees in its new Nairobi bureau and 300 others in expanded operations across the continent, the calm, reassuring tone of the BBC World Service, unprejudiced, unvarnished, and free from bias, would reach more people in more languages than ever. I just have to stop. Please help me.
Yeah, this is the same publication. As I said earlier on, this publication just does press releases, on behalf of whatever agenda it is pushing. It does press releases disguised and semi-clothed as journalism. The BBC was created to spread British propaganda.
Thank you very much. Could you repeat it? Could you repeat it again for those at the back?
The BBC was created to spread British propaganda, and it continues to spread British propaganda.
British propaganda, simple.
I think what they are, perturbed by the fact that now the BBC no longer has the exclusive monopoly domination. You see?
Yep.
In the era of the internet, in the era of social media, in the era of digital TV, that monopoly is gone. So now you have others spreading propaganda as well. You have China spreading its propaganda. You have Russia spreading its propaganda.
Turkey.
So they're complaining about the loss of monopoly, you see? Right. But then they go it on and they really malign Africans, right?
Yes.
By presuming that when the BBC outreach, which is much more vast than it is today, that Africans were just imbibing and believing everything 100%, right? Well, sadly, there were many who were persuaded and misled, but not all Africans.
True.
That's number one. But the worst thing they're saying is that only we have the right to mislead and misinform Africans. How dare, China,
anyone steps
Russia,
into the...
or whether it's Turkey, all these other new powers come on the scene to try to usurp our role of misleading. And why do you want to mislead? You want to mislead because you want to buy mental allegiance, right? You want mental allegiance. And why is mental allegiance important? Because the world competes in selling products to Africa. The world competes in acquiring minerals from African countries. So it's most likely the people that will do commerce and interact with you are the ones who are much more inclined to identify you as a much more positive entity, right? Associate you with only positive attributes as opposed to Russia and China. That's what they're doing. Why do they not have any issues with the United States? Because they are ideological on the same page. And they're both members of NATO. What is the purpose of the Voice of America? It is to spread U.S. propaganda around the world and in Africa.
Correct.
So why are they not complaining about that? If the issue is really that they're disturbed by the spread of propaganda and misinformation in Africa. So their argument can be easily debunked and disproved.
I continue. And it goes further. Hiring hundreds of employees only to fire nearly 1/6 of his workforce a few years later was not just a waste of public funds, critics say. It also weakened British influence in the developing world and ceded ground, like you said, to propaganda outfits in authoritarian states opposed to the West. I think you've basically you've touched it on the head right there.
Yes,
it
absolutely.
Is that opposition that they do not want.
But they're wrong. British influence eroded after many of these former colonies won formal independence. They're not fully decolonized, as I explained earlier. In fact, as I said, colonialism actually continues in a new form. But they lost access to considerable resources that they once had absolute control over. You see? Now, they actually have to speak a little nicely to these countries that were their former colonies. Because now Russia is on the scene. Now China is on the scene. Now Japan is on the scene. Brazil is on the scene. India is there. Turkey is there. You see? Whereas in the past, you had your colonial officials exercising military and political control. They would order the so-called natives, as they call them. They didn't even call them nicely, right? Even though they're the ones producing. Call them natives, order them to produce, and then you ship it overseas. So that ended when these countries got their what they call flag independent, right?
Yep.
It was not because of the erosion in fact, the BBC was growing because empire was still at its peak. So when empire was declining, why should you be shocked or surprised that the BBC would also decline? They need a better economic model. That model was only successful because it was predicated on monopoly control.
I'll take the last part. And the BBC service has long been regarded as Britain's preeminent soft power tool. Kofi Annan, the Ghanaian former United Nations Secretary General, described it as perhaps Britain's greatest gift to the world, saying that for millions across the world, it has been seen as a way of cutting through the veil of tyranny to provide uncensored news.
Okay, so let me address that for a minute.
Yeah.
And that we cannot ignore that particular aspect. And that particular aspect is true. And I'll tell you why. It is true because the post-colonial governments in most African countries were tyrannical. And it's not tyrannical because there was something unusual or peculiar about them. They were tyrannical because they inherited the British or French or Portuguese or Belgian or Spanish or German tyrannical system. You see, colonialism was a tyranny. The governor spoke, and that was it. When the governor didn't like something, he could declare a state of emergency. He could detain someone, correct? Without trial. The governor could rule by decree. There was no parliament, correct? The natives were ordered to produce and to purchase. And that is the state that many of these African, whether presidents or prime ministers, inherited. And they operated that same state. So even the media broadcast was tyrannical. At one time, most African countries had just one national radio station, one national newspaper. You see? So whenever Africans heard the BBC, that was like manna. It was from a gift from heaven. Because it said whatever the tyrannical African government was not saying. So it was very welcome. The government would not tell you if there was an insurgency going on and gaining ground, coming closer to the capital city. You could only hear that on the BBC. You see?
Yeah.
But having said that, it does not negate everything I said before that. The BBC at the same time was still spreading British propaganda. So while I agree with Anand on that particular context, I want to broaden it and put it in a larger context.
Okay. So finally, what would you say in terms of, I'm going to extrapolate now, would the Americans be in for some sort? I mean, I laugh in jest, but the serious nature of how he's moving in terms of people who are basically going to kowtow to whatever his whims and caprices are on the day seems to be the order with the way his cabinet speak and those around the corridors of power are, basically singing from the same hymn sheet. Could this be a tyrannical system in terms of the way the information flows? Could that be imposed on the American system, or do you think the American system would balk at such an imposition?
Yeah, absolutely. He knows he can only go so far.
Okay.
He cannot issue directives to MSNBC, to NBC, CBS, because at the end of the day, these are business entities, and they have shareholders, you see?
Okay.
So when you start affecting the pockets of Americans,
forget it.
Your name could be Sir Trump, but no, you're taking money out of me. That's the thing that will cause him some trouble if it starts impacting them economically.
But would it impact the output of the organization in terms of their broadcast or journalistic? I mean, I'm using the word journalistic in inverted commas now.
And I'm not a very big fan of many of these corporate entities, to be honest with you.
Okay.
Many of these corporate entities, corporate media, have been misleading the people anyway. Many of these corporate entities only focus on elite news coverage, right? There's a lot of classism that's not really been sufficiently analyzed. Stories of the low-income communities, are not sufficiently reported or investigated. You see? That's why they're so confused. They don't understand what's going on. They say, how could a vile, racist, misogynist like Donald Trump get millions of votes more than a relatively much more decent person like Kamala Harris, how could he win all the so-called swing states, battleground states? How could he get millions of votes more than she got? How is that possible? It's possible because there is a substantial segment of the U.S. population that is really hurting economically. You see? So he's making false promises that he would make the economy better for them. So they're willing. Think about it. 22% of the black male vote. So rather than saying, why would you vote for a person like Donald Trump, a racist who's still saying the 5 young men who were falsely convicted of the Central Park rape, he's still demonizing them. How could you, as a black man, vote for Donald Trump? They're willing to discount his racism. Think about that, in the hope that he will indeed stop those dangerous immigrants coming across the border and threatening my black job. That is saying a number of things. Number one, he's declaring that you as a black person, and he's mostly always directing it to the black men, you're only entitled to low-paying jobs. He's saying that, right? Indirectly. And then he's saying these Mexicans, these Africans now coming across the border, all of these Haitians, they're not going to get those high-paying jobs. They're going to get your low-paying black jobs.
Yeah.
And apparently, it works sufficiently to get him, 22% of the vote. I believe that argument more than the fact that, okay, there could be black males who are also misogynistic, but I don't think that misogynism of Donald Trump appealed to the larger percentage of that 22%. I think the pitch that's threatening your black job is what did it. And why are we not even in touch with this sense of desperation? Because their stories are not covered. They're only covered during election time when the polling shows that he's polling a little better with black males. And then we do stories the last 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, and that's going to have some impact or change things. We have a media crisis. Of course, he's a detestable person in what he says about media. He's not the right person to be attacking media, but that does not take away from the fact that as corporate media is constituted in the United States, it is also doing substantial damage to the national narrative. Think about it. Okay, let me give you the final point that people should ponder over. If you go to a CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, many of these talking heads are paid millions of dollars. They're part of the elite. So it's not surprising that to them, the world and the universe is about the elite, what the elite are thinking, what the elite are saying. You see? They cannot remove themselves and put themselves in the shoes of low-income people. And if this crisis is not handled with, it's going to become a crisis of the political system itself, So he's a danger, but media also a danger to themselves. Because if the bottom line becomes the priority, and you see what's going on right now, CNN, MSNBC, they're cutting staff, they're cutting resources, because at the end of the day, they want to satisfy the shareholders. I don't think in the long run that's a formula that can
is
work
sustainable
in a so-called democracy. You just can't. You need to find some balance, and that's why people could say, okay, the BBC may go to the other extreme. You need to find a balance somewhere. If you're going to have private media, you need to have a formula Say, for example, first of all, okay, so if we think diversity, right? Ethnic, religious, political is a good thing in corporate America, right? If we think that's fine, why should it not follow that there should be diversity in news, focus, and content as well?
That's an important
it's common
question.
Sense, but it's hard if I am the CEO at MSNBC or Fox News, right? Or CNN. And my number one priority is to make my media platform more profitable, right? When and under what circumstance am I going to contact my colleague and say, listen, guys, we are part of the problem. Let's have a conversation. No. Our number one concern is profit.
Profit, exactly.
And I can maximize profit by cutting costs, which of course reduces the quality of the journalism, which is already a challenge in the first place. So it becomes like a self-spiraling cycle toward destruction, The media may destroy themselves, but it won't be primarily because of Donald Trump.
Now, speaking of the media and how post-colonialism has been covered in Africa, we go to The Guardian for the next story, which it's about mining executives in Mali. And it reads, British mining executives held in Mali freed after a 160 deal to settle tax disputes. Resolute Mining Chief Teres Holohan and 2 employees have been held since 9th December. 3 British mining executives who have been detained by the government of Mali had been released and safe and well after agreeing to pay 160 to settle a tax dispute. They were detained at the end of a meeting with government officials held to discuss tax and other state claims that the miner had previously said were unsubstantiated. The miner agreed to pay $160 million to the Mali government this week to help resolve the tax dispute. It goes on. Resolute, which has a gold mine in Mali, said last week 3 employees have been treated well and were receiving support from the UK and other embassies and consulates. Mali, which is one of Africa's biggest gold exporters, rewrote its mining laws last year to increase state and local ownership in the industry and extract more money from international companies. Negotiations with international mining companies have been fraught. In September, the government detained 4 local employees of Barrick Gold, the world's second largest gold miner by market capitalization, for 4 days. Now, this is the funny part. Mali had been battling the jihadist insurgents for more than a decade after the Libyan civil war destabilized the Sahel region to its south. With many Western donors leaving the country, Mali's government has been struggling to raise money to pay the Russian mercenaries and fund its own military. Can you spot anything in that story?
Yes. All right. So, more power to Mali, of course. Mali, by rewriting its laws, it's directly attacking neocolonialism and global economic imperialism. And if they paid $160 million, it means the true amount owed might have actually even been higher.
Be much more than
correct?
that. Yeah, correct.
Companies would not pay $160 million without saying, no, we are not paying, we're going to take this for international arbitration jurisdiction, right? Some court, that's what they would have done. And the fact that they're continuing to do business there shows you how profitable that it was worth paying the $160 million. And indeed, it was owed. So that's a good development. So what Mali is doing is it did what Jerry Rawlings did when he came to power in Ghana with Kaiser Alumina. And because Kaiser had the factory, the aluminum plant, right?
Yeah.
Producing aluminum, but the government controlled the power, the water, right, from the Volta River project. And so when Rawlings came, they said, you know what, we know you've been underpaying our country since the days of Kwame Nkrumah.
Yeah.
So we are demanding an increase in the price that you pay us for electricity. And Kaiser refused. So the Ghanaians said, okay, go and pump your own water then. There's going to be no power flowing. So what did they do? They increased the rate that they were paying Ghana by 3 times, 300%, which meant they owed Ghana 3 times, dating back to when Nkrumah opened that plant in 1966.
Wow.
I don't know whether that back money was recovered, but going forward, that was what they started paying. Henceforth, Tanzania did the same thing. It was with gold as well, under the late President Magufuli. He said, you've been stealing. They said, no, we've not been stealing. He said, no, you've been stealing. We want you to pay us the back amount you owe us for the gold, which you've been getting for peanuts. These are the new rates. This is the new fair, equitable rate. They refused. So Magufuli said, okay, so the contract is gone. I'm not going to honor it. What are you going to do? So there was an impasse for a long time. They realized Tanzania was not going to budge. They came back and they paid. Tanzania raised substantial amounts that went into infrastructure. The roads, the railways, all upgraded. So many people decried and still criticize Magufuli because of his approach to dealing with the COVID pandemic. He was almost like a COVID denier. Yeah, so they bash him for that. But overwhelmingly, they remember him fondly for what he did to the Tanzanian economy, and particularly how he dealt with that issue with the mining industry. So I see that Mali is learning from that. I hope more African countries learn from that, because most of these countries should not be economically impoverished. They have the minerals that the world needs, the world wants, and as the late Professor John Henry Clark said, the world does not want to pay for. Let them pay.
Can you imagine if every African country were to reappraise its dealings with all these foreign companies?
Right. And I urge the youth of Africa, because a lot of this, they're responding to the pressure coming from the young people. In countries where your governments are not talking or actively dealing with renegotiating all these contracts, youth, you have nothing to lose. Come out to the streets and give them some pressure, because they're taking money away from your table. Resources that should go to developing the economies so that you don't have to go and drown in the Mediterranean trying to clean some toilet in Europe, or trying to make it to the United States, to the jungles of South America. That is your money. If your government is not delivering, push them out.
Well, speaking of not delivering, we go to the Financial Times for our next story. And it's usually the story is of male thievery. But the UK imposes sanctions on Isabel dos Santos in money laundering crackdown. Africa's former richest woman, and exiled, I'll focus the story on her anyway, exiled Ukrainian oligarch Dmytro Fetach among 3 hit by measures. The UK has imposed sanctions on 3 people, including Africa's former richest woman, as the Labour government steps up effort to clamp down on those who enable money laundering through Britain's financial system. The measures hit Isabella dos Santos, the daughter of Angola's former president, and who is accused of money from the country's gas supplies, and as well as Avers Lembeck, one of Latvia's richest men who were jailed last year for bribery by a court in Riga. Former Foreign Secretary David Lammy said the sanctions mark the first step in delivering an ambition to take on kleptocrats and the dirty money that empowers them, he added. The tide is turning. The golden age of money laundering is over. The designations were made under a UK regulation aimed at combating global corruption, passed in 2021, which allows sanctions to be levied on people involved directly or indirectly in bribery or misappropriation of property. It has been now used against 50 individuals. The Foreign Office said Thursday's sanctions mark a step change in how the government is using its sanction powers to make the UK a more hostile environment for corporate powers to operate in, by also targeting enablers helping to move wealth into UK assets. Where is the part? Okay, the last part for me. Dos Santos, who once claimed to be Africa's former woman billionaire, systematically abused her position at state-run companies to loot Angola's resources during her father's 38-year rule. The UK said as it imposed an asset freeze and travel ban on her. She rose to chair Angola State Oil Company under her father's rule after amassing business interests across the economy. Her downfall began soon after a new president came to power in 2017, and since 2020 she has faced lawsuits or criminal investigations in multiple countries. Here we go. Over to you.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I support this totally, of course.
Okay.
She never, created some software or some technology, digital technology that, just sold phenomenally all over the world. So what was the source of her, $1 billion?
Well, yeah.
The source was, of course, being the daughter of Dos Santos, who put her in charge of the monopolies, which was, of course, the oil and the gas and the telecom industry in Angola. And that is how she accumulated that wealth on behalf of herself and, of course, on behalf of the family. Probably getting a cut in all those deals.
All deals. Yeah.
Having shares, private shares that were very valuable and lucrative, of course. So, yeah, the money needs to be recovered and needs to be returned to Angola because it belongs to the people of Angola, the taxpayers. What to me is interesting is that the article does not address it, so I'm not sure whether this is something that the Foreign Secretary is going to deal with as well.
But yes,
it should not be limited to the notable personalities like Isabella Dos Santos. There are many who may not be as prominent who have been stealing money from African countries. And to the extent that those funds can be traced within the United Kingdom, those individuals should be subjected to sanctions and their money should also be returned. So that's the only part that I think is missing in the story. And I would like that to be addressed as well.
Would it be right to suggest the sanctions could also be abused?
The sanctions could do what?
Could it be, just like the United States tends to abuse the use of its sanctions on people, could this sanctions regime also be used to the detriment of officials from other countries?
That's possible, but it doesn't mean that they should gut it for that reason alone. If that issue comes, then that should be addressed, as they come along. They should be challenged. But in this particular case, there's no question about the fact that she accumulated the resources from state institutions. So when it's clear-cut like this, it needs to be supported and celebrated. We know that in many other African countries, we know, for example, in Equatorial Guinea, right? That's an issue that needs to be dealt with. In fact, something like this should inspire more inquiry on the family that is now the Nguema family that is running the show in Equatorial Guinea right now.
It's
in
funny
Mozambique, we have this multi-billion-dollar gas, operation and Total coming on board. I'm sure stealing will occur if stealing has not already occurred.
Yeah.
These are the things we have to be thinking about.
It's funny that you mentioned that there should be an inquiry. Actually, there was a book published by Tom Burgess titled The Looting Machine. Isabella is actually mentioned in there. Nguema is mentioned in there.
Interesting.
Mobutu is in there.
Right.
I mean, a whole host of names.
Okay. So, apologies to my brother, because my brother actually, Andrew, got me a copy of that book last year.
No.
I am ashamed to confess that I haven't read it yet.
My
but
God.
now I will. Now that you've held it up like that to shame me, I'm going to read it.
So you've allowed the looting machine to gather dust.
Yes, I have it. I will read it for sure.
It is a brilliant read. It's a
Right.
brilliant. I mean, even in page 10, the expose, from page 10, the expose is on Isabella dos Santos. And it goes into detail.
Okay, so this is my suggestion then. I'll read it, and at some point, let's devote an episode to discuss it.
Yeah, we should. Yeah,
Okay.
looting. Yeah. So, speaking of from looting to leaders who have decided, abduction is the way to deal with their opponents in inverted commas. We go to the New York Times for our next and final story, which is tied to Uganda's opposition leader who was kidnapped in Kenya turns up in court. Kizza Besigye, a former presidential candidate, went missing over the weekend as he visited the Kenyan capital, reappearing days later in military custody back in Uganda. A prominent Ugandan opposition leader, a figure who disappeared last week while in neighboring Kenya, surfaced on Wednesday in a military court back home, where he was charged with security-related offenses, if white and Ugandan officials said. The latest case to raise alarm and a widening opposition crackdown in both East African nations. Kizza Besigye, a former presidential candidate in Uganda, was kidnapped on Saturday while visiting the capital, Nairobi, for a book launch by Kenyan politician. His wife, Winnie Byanyima, said on social media early on Wednesday. Ms. Byanyima did not elaborate on how Mr. Besigye was abducted or by whom. Now we go further for more details. Mr. Besigye, who is also a physician, has in the last been arrested and assaulted by security officers, placed under house arrest to prevent him holding political rallies, and accused of treason and rape. He was acquitted of rape, and the treason charges were later squashed. On Wednesday, Kenya and Uganda's opposition officials decried the mysterious ways in which Mr. Besigye was removed from Kenya, which have seen a wave of abductions in recent months. This includes the kidnap and torture of activists and protesters who have been agitating against the government of President William Ruto. Kenya must decide whether they want to be a constitutional democracy governed by the premise of the Bill of Rights and tenets of justice, or a tyranny. James Orengo, the governor of Siaya County and a member of the opposition Orange Democratic Movement, said on social media. In October, the United Nations Refugee Agency said it was deeply concerned that Kenya had sent back 4 Turkish refugees who had been abducted by marksmen at gunpoint. In July, 3 dozen opposition members who had traveled to Kenya, participated in governor cause, were also deported. They were charged with terrorism-related once they arrived home. Before you, question is, could you speak to Kenya with the level of abduction before you go to the state-sanctioned violence that is Uganda?
Well, I think the true Ruto is now stepping forward once again. You see?
Okay.
And, even without dealing with the Ugandan opposition
situation,
leader, Besigye,
yeah,
the history of abduction of opponents domestically is very prominent in both Kenya and Uganda. You don't hear about it in Tanzania, although now, recently, ironically, under the current government, I'm hearing stories about that more now. But historically, it's been very prominent in both Uganda and Tanzania. In Uganda, it became very prominent during the reign of General Idi Amin. people would be abducted, then the bodies would be found floating on the River Nile, right? In Kenya, it was not as pervasive as it was in Uganda during Idi Amin, but it's also widespread. And a few prominent politicians were abducted and their bodies were later found. And the one that I can remember, most prominent one that I can remember offhand, even though there are a couple, was the foreign minister, Robert Ouko, abducted, within Kenya, obviously by state agencies, and his remains later found. He's dead. So the practice is there. And then, of course, we've heard about it recently after the anti-tax protests by the youth in Kenya. And then it emerged that many of the youth leaders had also been abducted. There was a lot of international pressure from Kenyan civil society, and subsequently they were released. I think most, if not all, have been released. So the Kenya that we see now is more or less the Kenya that the Ruto that people were more familiar with. Remember, Ruto was a defendant at the International Criminal Court before he became president, right?
Yep, along with
Uhuru Kenyatta, right? They were charged, and then subsequently, as president and deputy president, they were brought before the court. And what was one of the reasons? Ruto was never acquitted. Sometimes people forget that. The case was suspended.
Indeed, yeah.
A suspended case can be reactivated. But why was it suspended? Because witnesses were going missing, being abducted, and just disappearing, right?
Reinvent himself.
Yeah, the Ruto there was trying to reinvent himself, repackage himself. I was invited to the White House, and there's all this talk about the new Kenya, the new Ruto, and so on and so forth, right?
And he sat in the big chair.
The tax protest started. And then we saw the tyrannical Ruto reemerge. So that is the setting under which we should evaluate this incident involving Kizza Besigye. And then, of course, as the article also mentions, there have been, some additional abductions as well of other foreign nationals, including Turkish refugees, people that actually had official formal refugee status allowed by the Kenyan state to be abducted by foreign agents and taken back to their country. That is the Kenya that we have today. So essentially we have two rogue rulers, in East Africa, the Kenyan President Ruto and the Ugandan military dictator, General Museveni. Because there's no way could Ruto say that he was not, with how Besigye could have been abducted from Kenya and returned across the borders to Uganda. We don't have open borders yet. We still have security on the border. We still have customs and immigration on both sides of the border.
Wow. So now, could you speak to the situation in Uganda that would allow for such an abduction to have taken place?
Oh, no, it's clear. In Uganda, there's a military regime. General Museveni has been in power for 38 years now.
38 years.
So occasionally he wears his military uniform. Occasionally, depending on who he's meeting, he wears his civilian attire. When he's meeting with U.S. officials or potential investors, he wears his civilian. And then as soon as they leave, when he's admonishing Ugandans, threatening Ugandans, he has on his military uniform. And his son, General Muhoozi, the same way. Depending on who he's meeting, he wears civilian, like father, like son. Depending on who he's lambasting, he wears on his military uniform. So we have the papa dog, baby dog situation in Uganda, which once prevailed in Haiti, of course, the father dictator grooming the son to inherit the mantle from him. And obviously, they live they imposed a reign of tyranny and terror, but they themselves live under terror as well.
Yeah,
because they know the people can only
would
tolerate something
so
like that for such a long time.
Yeah,
everything has a limit. When will the limit break is what keeps them awake at night. So, obviously he knows that Besigye is a prominent opposition leader. Bobi Wine, the prominent leading opposition leader right now, so he's always wondering and worried about what might they be up to. It is through these individuals and their followers that the dictatorship in Uganda will come to an end at some point, and hence the abduction of Besigye. And what was one of the charges that they're alleging? That he was found with 2 pistols. So with the 2 pistols, he's going to bring down the Ugandan military regime. And then they were discussing military installations, presumably to attack them with 2 pistols.
With 2 pistols.
It's so comical, it's not even comical. But, as I said, I hate using the term banana republic because it has racist connotations by Europeans. But Ruto indeed is behaving like a banana republic dictator, And it has, unfortunately, serious negative consequences on the Kenyan state and the perception toward Kenya that outsiders now have, Shame on Ruto.
The worst part about the Kenyan situation is it's supposed to be the bastion of democracy. But the fact that it's
particularly in East Africa,
exactly,
given the chaos in Uganda.
Yeah. The only time I think Kenya almost got sucked into the regime of coups was 81 or 82. 81 during the Moi years.
Yes, Daniel Arap Moi.
Yeah. But aside from that, it's been a bastion of relative peace. But
right, when you compare to Uganda, absolutely. The military have been more or less much, much more professional. Compared to Uganda, the military have been very destructive, massive human rights abuses since independence, actually, since shortly after independence.
Yeah.
Since 1966 in particular, when there was a political crisis between, at that time, Prime Minister Milton Obote and the traditional king of Buganda, Sir Edward Mutesa, and Obote unleashed the armed forces against Mutesa. And at that time, the commander was Idi Amin. And then it's been downhill since then in terms of the military and its role in Ugandan politics.
It's the usual pattern. That's how he starts, even in Nigeria in 1966. The same pattern. Small political crisis, you bring out the army, you can never take them back yet.
Correct.
So, okay. Any last words? As usual, we've come to the end.
I'm very happy, as I said, to be a regular contributor with you, comrade, in enlightening our people on the importance of understanding what is being said when something is said.
Yep.
Sometimes the meanings are hidden. The meanings need to be revealed and exposed so that we can be better informed. Well, the only thing I would add is that you should provide your contact information. If people have been reading some items in the European media, in the Western media, that they're not sure of and they needed to be deconstructed, we are here to help you deconstruct.
Yes. Okay. So you could email me at adesoji@gmail.com. Again, it's adesoji@gmail.com, and we'll take your stories forward and bring it on here and, deconstruct, as it were. And I must say thank you again to Comrade Milton. And from me, it is good night for now.
See you next week.
That's a wrap for this week on the African News Review podcast. We hope you are leaving with a clearer, more truthful picture of Africa. Remember, every story has another side, and we're here to uncover it. Don't forget to join us next Sunday at 12 p.m. Eastern as we continue to challenge the narratives and reclaim Africa's voice. If you've enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeing Africa for what it truly is.